Hey guys, this is a review of Chapter 2. If you were in class, you do not need to watch this video. Chapter 2 concerns research in social psychology and why it is so important that we know how to correctly read or evaluate the current research, especially it's thrown at us, when we're reading, when we're watching TV. We're inundated with research and numbers, and so it's very important that we know how to read and understand this research. Excuse me. So, what if the discipline of social psychology were built on personal experience, observations, very subjective, and the intuition of everyone who's just interested in a social psychological question? We would have a bunch of very interesting theories and ideas, but we'd have a mess, and we would really have no answers whatsoever. So learning about research methods really improves our reasoning about real life events. How often do we see studies about like blind taste tests, or especially right now political polls? So do we just take what they tell us at face value? Because they are the news, and so they're supposed to tell us the truth, right? Or do we kind of look at that research and dig a little bit deeper? So remember, social psychology is the scientific study of how people think, feel, and act. Scientific study means that it can be proven to be correct. It can also be proven to be incorrect. It is probably more often proven to be incorrect than correct. How do we develop ideas for research? How do we begin the research process? We start by asking questions. We first, if we have a question, we look at the available research to find out exactly what has or has not already been done. We don't want to reinvent the wheel. There's no need for us to do research on something that has already been done, especially if there's a large amount of research. We don't want to redo the exact same research to come to the exact same conclusions. However, we can gain, even if we do see that our question, has already been answered, we can, from that research, gain additional questions that we can then research. We begin the process through our own experience. We can come up with questions through observations, events in the news, questions about the past. Some of the most interesting research in social psychology is stems from questions about the past, especially World War II, Vietnam War, and people just want to know how, people like Adolf Hitler were able to make people obey them and really just change their whole persona. And so a lot of our research questions come from events in the past. So the first thing in our scientific study is we develop our hypothesis. We want it to be clear and simple. We want it to be testable, and we want it to generate additional research. In the end, if our testing, if we've come up with some answers, we can generate a theory. Theories explain our findings so that we can better understand and predict future behavior. A theory also kind of gets your ideas out there to other researchers so that they can then, the same thing, when they have a question, they can then use your research to help answer their questions as well. There are two basic types of research, basic research and applied research. So basic research is used to increase our understanding of human behavior. Most often it's used to test a specific factor of a hypothesis. It's not particularly coming up with solutions to questions. So it might be, how does caffeine affect the brain, or does stress affect whether we cheat in school or on the job? This basic research might lead to deeper questions, which is where applied research comes in. Applied research tries to answer the questions, helps us understand like real world events, and contribute to actually solving problems, such as what might be the best way for a student to study in order to decrease their stress so that they don't cheat. So after we form our hypothesis, which is our question, then we look at our variables. Variables are simply a factor of the observation. In chapter 1, we talked about the bike riders, and the very first social psychology experiment was when one scientist noticed that the bike riders rode faster when they had a crowd. So he wondered, was it due to the crowd or was it due to something else? So that would be a variable. The crowd is a variable. Were there other variables that contributed to their increased speed other than the crowd? Our variables help us to define things in specific measurable terms. Our variables must be operationally defined, which means they're very, very specific. So in class, we use the example of a smile. There's many different types of smiles. So if you're talking about a smile for happiness, you'll want to describe, teeth showing and raised cheeks or whatever, raised eyebrows and wrinkles around the eyes, that sort of thing. So every variable you want to be operationally defined so that someone else coming in can use the same variables. Oh, let me see. Construct validity in a test denotes whether the test or method used to measure the variable is actually measuring the variable. Again, in class, we used the example of a personality test. A personality test you find online might very well measure your personality, but what if I was to try and use that personality test to measure your intelligence? Would it be a valid test of intelligence? No. So we want to be very careful that how we are measuring our variables, that they're valid measurements. We cannot prove construct validity, but we can support it by comparing our test with other tests claiming to measure the same thing. If we get comparable results, our test is likely valid. Ways to measure variables. One of the most often used in social psychology is self-report. It is simple. Almost everyone can do it. There are several different ways that we can self-report. There are some problems with self-report. One is it's just not always accurate. Sometimes we want to paint ourselves in a better light. We want to give the more socially acceptable answer rather than what we actually think. It can also be affected by the way the question is asked. If you phrase something using the words global warming versus climate change, you are very likely going to get different answers, especially from conservatives. It's also affected by our memories. So if you are giving a self-report about something that happened 5 years ago, it's very likely that time has changed your memory or your perception of the event a bit. Another way to measure variables are by observations. They tend to avoid subjective fallacies, so where we're trying to make ourselves look better. However, the rater, the person making the observations, can have the same type of bias, and so that can affect the results a little bit. What if the person being watched knows that they're being observed, and so they might act differently than they would if they did not know they were being observed? We also want to make certain in general we have more than one observer or rater to make certain we have inter-rater reliability. So if you had 2 or more raters and one said, something happened 10 times and one said something happened 3 times, we do not have inter-rater reliability. And so that is not a valid measure of, it's not a valid measurement. There would be no construct validity in that. You need both raters to rate approximately the same. We have several different types of research. Descriptive, which records how often people think, feel, or act regarding a certain event. There are several different examples in the book. One of them, it discusses surveys. I definitely recommend you read the section on surveys to get just a greater understanding of the necessity, the things that are very, very important in surveys, especially regarding the population. Factors such as race, age, sex, income, education, cultural background can affect the results, so you want to be very careful in choosing the population that you give that survey to. Correlational measures variables that are not manipulated, so we want to see if one variable affects another, such as sleep and study time, or study time and grade, that sort of thing. Does your high school GPA predict college success? Those are two variables. We're not manipulating them. We're not changing them in any way. We're just seeing if one affects the other, not if one causes the other. Correlation does not equal causation. If we want to determine cause and effect, we need to do an experiment. Experiments are two things that we need: random assignment and manipulated conditions. So the researcher controls the variables, and people are randomly assigned to one of two or more groups. We often use a control group as well, where there's no intervention given, so we get base rate, so your baseline results, and then that gives you greater validity as well. We want the experiment to be generalizable, meaning it can be tested by other groups. So when we are doing an experiment, we're very, very careful to truthfully record everything that is done and that happens. If similar results are not reproducible, then we do not have external validity, and it's really worthless. Really quick, we talked about ethics, especially do no harm. There are several studies that have been done that, well, not intending to be harmful, were such as Stanley Milgram's test for obedience, and he had people administer electric shocks even when they thought the person who was not actually being harmed was like screaming and crying and dying, and like 70% of people still gave these electric shocks out of obedience. So Milgram wanted to do that because he was very interested in how Hitler got so many people to do what he said. We also discussed the Stanford prison experiment, where just normal college students went in, and half of them were prison guards and half of them were prisoners. And the way that the prison guards just really treated the prisoners, the study had to be ended early because it was so detrimental to their health. So while both of those were important and did give us a lot of really good research, it was very detrimental to the people that were in the studies, their mental health. So we really want to watch that. Neither of those would be experiments that we would be allowed to do in present times. I believe that is... After an experiment, we always two things, especially informed consent before an experiment and debriefing after. So we always let them know what the purpose and a lot of the details of the experiment were, to kind of try to lessen any harm that could have possibly been done, although we're very, very, very careful nowadays that no harm is done. That was chapter 2 in a very quick nutshell. I will see you guys again later this week.